So one thing, people sometimes wonder about is, it seems like when I have a choice of, let's say I'm writing a method, and the method takes a parameter. I've got a choice of the type for that parameter. As I make, so we sort of understand the trade-off now. If I make, you think about the tree of Java objects or the hierarchy of Java objects. Capital objects at the top, it's the superclass of everything. And then as I go down and I define more classes, I might have a dog that extends pet that extends object, dog that extends pet, mutt that extends dog. As I get farther and farther down, the types get more specific, and we know more about the object that's being passed to the method. So if I have a method that accepts mutts, for example, that method can't be called on a dog or a pet, but it can access all of the mutt-specific information that that instance has. If I go the other direction, if I go up and I'm taking more general references like capital O objects, I can call that method on more types of Java objects, but it knows less about each object. On some level, the limiter here is object, capital O object. If I have a method that accepts a parameter of type capital O object, then the only things I can rely on and having are a toString method and an equals method and hash code and some of those common capital O object methods that we've talked about. So the question is sort of like, why would you ever do that? And the trade-off here is capability versus generality. So as I go up, as I sort of go up from, for example, a mutt to a dog to a pet, I'm able to work with more instances, more types of objects, but I know less about them. As I go down, I'm able to work with fewer types of objects, but I know more about them because I can assume more about their structure and their contents. One analogy I like to use here that may or may not help you is kind of like, imagine you're sitting next to somebody on a plane. You sit down, I guess we used to take plane rides at some point in the past, but imagine, you start talking with them. Initially, you know nothing about them, right? So that's this, very, very general conversation. And when you are in a position where you need to talk to somebody, you might, again, not know anything about them. And you might need to pick a conversational topic that would kind of work for anybody. So imagine that, you're sitting next to somebody on a plane and it's like, how's it going? Talk about the weather. Maybe everybody talks about the weather. Maybe you know where you are, like where you're taking off from. So what were you doing in Tampa or Champaign or whatever? You might look at them and notice something about them. But at the beginning, the conversation has to be very general because it's a conversation that you have to be able to have with anybody. That's sort of like accepting capital O object in your method. Now, as you learn more about them, you can start to talk to them differently. Now, and imagine, if we were in this class together, imagine that you sit down at the cafeteria or in a common space on campus when we used to do that with somebody. Now, because of the context, you know a little bit more about them. You're like, you're probably an Illinois student, so you might have a different conversation. There are things that you would bring up with them that you probably wouldn't bring up with just a random stranger on a plane, because you kind of assume that they know maybe, if we won a basketball game last week or something about campus or whatever, right? Because you're assuming more about them. Now imagine that person is sitting next to you in, where we used to have in-person labs for this class. So now you know a lot more about them, right? You know that they're in CS 125, they're working on the same homework problems that you're working on, whatever. And so now you can have a conversation that's much more specific. Now, on the other hand, as we go down that hierarchy, the groups are getting smaller. So there's more people in the world that you can have a general conversation with than there are people at the University of Illinois that you might meet in the union, than there are people in CS 125 that you might meet in a lab section. And so, it's the same sort of thing, right? The types of things you can talk about with everybody allow you to talk about to a large group of people, but you don't know as much about them, and so you can't talk about certain specific things. If you found out that the person on the plane next to you was in CS 125, it's sort of like a downcast, right? It's like, oh, well, now I can downcast you to a CS 125 student, and I can suddenly, call these methods like, let's talk about yesterday's homework problem or whatever, right? So that's on some level the best analogy I can come up with for this particular idea. And we're going to see the usefulness of being able to accept objects and work with capital objects as a parameter, particularly in the third half of the class when we start to design some containers together that can store any type of Java object. So this is something that we'll return to. I wanted to plant the seeds of this idea in your mind now to get you thinking about it, but we'll have a chance to talk about it again later.